Wow, this is quite the topic you've given me for this deep dive.
Yeah.
Is Donald Trump a fascist, a racist, or both?
Mm.
It's a question that's been debated endlessly, it seems like.
It has been a very controversial topic.
And we're going to try to tackle it today using these excerpts you sent over from Trump, Fascist or Racist, by the Impact Library.
Right.
And I got to say, looking at this material, this is going to be a wild ride, I think.
It's a really fascinating question, I think, and it gets right to the heart of a lot of issues in American politics and society today.
For sure. And I think, from the outset, our mission here isn't to label anyone definitively,
Right.
but to really dissect these arguments,
Right.
explore what they reveal about, the
Yeah.
current political landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that makes it so interesting is that there are really compelling arguments on both sides.
Okay, so to really dig into this,
Yeah.
I'm thinking we can look at sort of three key periods, right?
Yeah.
So let's start with his 2016 campaign. Then we'll look at his presidency, so, 2017 to 2021.
Yeah.
And then, I know, none of us have a crystal ball,
Right.
but we'll try to look at what another Trump term in 2024 could potentially look like for the country.
Yeah. Sounds good.
And full disclosure, you gave me a ton to unpack here.
Yeah.
I may need your help guiding us through this maze.
Happy to help.
So let's rewind back to 2016.
Mm-hmm.
The Trump campaign is in full swing.
Right.
His slogan, "Make America Great Again," is absolutely everywhere.
It was inescapable.
On the surface, it seems pretty straightforward, right?
Mm.
Appealing to the sense of national pride,
Right.
desire for better times, the good old days.
Yeah.
But you know what I think is so fascinating?
What's that?
It's how that slogan landed with different people.
Oh, yeah.
Because for some, it really did evoke this nostalgia,
Like this longing for a time when America was perceived as stronger, more prosperous.
More dominant on the world stage.
Right.
But for others, and particularly for people of color, that slogan tapped into a much, much darker history.
Absolutely.
A time when America's greatness, so to speak, was built on the backs of marginalized groups.
And their exploitation.
Exactly. And I think, this is where we start to see those seeds, this deep polarization
Right.
that have come to, really define our politics, taking root.
And it wasn't just about disagreement on policy. It was deeper than that.
Right.
It was about identity, about values.
Totally. And I think, nowhere was that more apparent than in his rhetoric on immigration.
Yeah.
I think back to those early campaign speeches where he talked about Mexican immigrants.
Right.
And I mean, those were explosive statements, to say the least.
They were incredibly inflammatory and clearly designed to tap into some pretty ugly prejudices.
Totally, to say that Mexico is sending rapists and criminals.
Yeah, that's not just a policy position. That's demonizing an entire group of people.
And it wasn't just the words themselves, right?
No, it was the refusal to back down.
It was the doubling down.
Even when people were calling him out for it.
Right. And even when people were saying hey, you know what, this is racist.
Yeah, and then there was that whole controversy about his hesitation to disavow support from white supremacist groups.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Which, whether intentional or not, it certainly didn't help the perception.
Right. It fueled the anxiety.
That he was, at the very least, okay with their support.
Yeah.
Which, made a lot of people really nervous.
Okay, so we've got this perfect storm brewing, right? We've got economic anxieties, cultural shifts, racial tensions.
Simmering beneath the surface.
And then Trump comes along with this "Make America Great Again" message. And it's like he throws a match on the whole thing.
He gave a voice to a lot of these anxieties that people had, but maybe weren't talking about openly.
Right. And for people who felt left behind by globalization, by economic changes, his message resonated deeply.
It did.
But, even if we set aside the explicitly racist rhetoric, there's this whole other layer to unpack here about the underlying racial dynamics at play.
Right, because even when he wasn't using explicitly racist language, his policies and actions still often had a disproportionate impact on communities of color.
Right, and I think that's what we're going to start to unpack as we move forward here.
Absolutely.
So let's dig into some specific examples. His one that comes to mind immediately is his signature policy, the travel ban.
Right.
Targeting several Muslim-majority countries.
Right. And regardless of what the administration's claims were about national security, the fact that it targeted specific religious groups raised a lot of concerns about discrimination.
Oh, for sure.
And when you look at the way it was implemented,
Right.
the chaos and the fear it caused for families that were just trying to enter the U.S.,
Yeah.
it's hard to ignore the human cost of that policy.
And then there were his efforts to curb both legal and illegal immigration.
Right.
The wall, the family separations at the border.
Yeah, the attempts to end DACA.
Yeah, I mean, these weren't just like abstract policy debates.
Right.
These were having real-world consequences for real people.
Absolutely.
And the language he used to talk about immigrants, animals, infestations,
Right.
this dehumanizing rhetoric,
Yeah.
it created this climate of fear and intolerance,
It did.
which had tangible repercussions.
Yeah, we saw a rise in hate crimes.
Oh, absolutely.
And a lot of immigrants, even those who were here legally,
Yeah.
felt increasingly vulnerable and unwelcome,
Right.
which is, understandable.
And it's not just his immigration policies.
Right.
Think about his response to the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, particularly after those high-profile incidents of police violence against Black individuals.
Right.
He often downplayed the issue of systemic racism.
Yeah.
And often framed the protesters themselves as the problem,
Totally.
rather than acknowledging the underlying grievances that were fueling the movement.
It felt like he was actively trying to silence conversations about race and inequality, rather than engaging with them.
Right. He wasn't interested in having those conversations in a meaningful way.
And I think that disconnect, that lack of empathy, that really gets to the heart of the question we're exploring here.
It does.
Is this just about disagreeing on policy, or is there something deeper, something maybe a little more insidious going on?
Yeah, because it's not always about being able to prove intent.
Right.
Sometimes it's about looking at the patterns of behavior, the impact of the policies, and the way that rhetoric is used to reinforce existing power structures and prejudices.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here,
Yeah.
just in looking at the 2016 campaign.
We have.
We've seen the rise of this divisive rhetoric, the targeting of specific groups, this amplification of existing anxieties,
Yeah.
and the manipulation of language to achieve political ends.
Absolutely.
It's a lot to take in, but it lays the foundation, I think, for understanding what came next.
It does.
His presidency and the lasting impact it has had on American politics.
And it's important to remember that this is just the beginning.
Yeah.
The trends we've identified here, they continue to play out in different ways throughout his presidency and even beyond.
Right, and we're going to get into that.
Oh, we are.
So buckle up, because we're about to dive even deeper into these murky waters.
We are.
And trust me, you're not going to want to miss what comes next.
It's going to be good. So, we ended part one talking about how the 2016 campaign really laid the groundwork for what was to come.
Yeah. I mean, campaigning is one thing, but governing, being president,
Yeah.
that's a whole other beast.
Right. Much higher stakes.
So how did those campaign promises, that fiery rhetoric,
Right.
translate into actual policies and actions once he was in the Oval Office?
Well, in a lot of ways, his presidency really was kind of an extension of that campaign. We saw a continuation of those divisive tactics, the attacks on democratic norms, and that really strong focus on appealing to his base, often at the expense of broader unity.
One of the things that really struck me during his presidency was this constant undermining of institutions.
Right.
It wasn't just disagreeing with policies. It was about delegitimizing the very systems of government.
Right. Like, he wasn't just saying, I disagree with this policy. He was saying the people who made this policy are corrupt.
Yeah.
Or they're the enemy, or they can't be trusted.
Yeah, and it's so interesting, because he would attack the media,
Yeah.
calling them the enemy of the people.
Fake news. Right.
Yeah.
That was a favorite.
Constantly accusing them of spreading fake news. He also went after the judiciary.
Yeah.
Criticizing judges who ruled against him, questioning their impartiality.
Right, accusing them of being biased against him, even though
that's their job.
Right, exactly. Judges are supposed to be impartial. They're supposed to rule based on the law, not on personal feelings.
But it was any check on his power
Right.
was illegitimate in his eyes.
It was a threat.
And let's not forget his constant attacks on the intelligence community, especially during the Russia investigation.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. He was constantly trying to discredit their findings, undermine their credibility.
It felt like he was trying to sow this distrust
He was.
in any source of information that challenged his narrative.
Right, and that's really dangerous, for a democracy, because when people lose faith in institutions,
Yeah.
when they don't trust the media, when they don't trust the courts, when they don't trust the intelligence agencies,
Right.
then they become more susceptible to misinformation,
Yeah.
to propaganda, to conspiracy theories.
Totally. And it creates this vacuum where truth is really up for grabs.
And in that vacuum, authoritarian tendencies can flourish.
It's like he was laying the groundwork, maybe intentionally, maybe not,
It's hard to
for
tell.
something potentially more sinister.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the rhetoric either, right? It was also his actions.
Right.
Remember when he tried to pressure Ukraine into investigating his political rivals?
Oh yeah, that was wild.
I mean, that was a pretty blatant abuse of power,
Yeah.
using his office for personal gain.
Yeah, and then, I mean, how can we forget the January 6th insurrection?
Right?
His attempts to interfere with the 2020 election?
Right.
I mean, that was a direct assault
It was.
on the very foundations of American democracy.
Yeah, thinking back to that day, it's still hard to believe that it actually happened. Like
Yeah.
a mob storming the Capitol,
Fueled by his lies.
fueled by lies about a stolen election.
It's like we were watching a coup unfold, in real time.
It was a really dark day for American democracy, and, it was a stark reminder
Yeah.
of just how fragile those democratic norms really are.
Especially when you have a leader who's willing to exploit them, for their own benefit.
Right, exactly. And it's a chilling precedent
Yeah.
that continues to cast a shadow over our politics.
Okay, so we've talked about the attacks on institutions, this
Yeah.
erosion of trust, these dangerous precedents that he set during his presidency.
Yeah.
But what about, like, the specific policies that were implemented?
Right.
How did those fit into this larger conversation about racism and fascism?
Well, I think one area where we saw a very clear continuation of that campaign rhetoric was in the immigration policies.
Right.
The travel ban, the border wall, the family separations,
Yeah.
These all disproportionately impacted communities of color.
Right.
And they reinforced that us versus them mentality.
Remember those horrifying images of children being separated from their parents at the border?
Yeah, it was really disturbing.
I mean, that wasn't just about enforcing immigration laws.
No, it was about sending a message.
It was about creating a deterrent
Right.
through cruelty.
Through cruelty, exactly.
And it played right into this white nationalist narrative
It did.
that America should be a white Christian nation.
Yeah.
And anyone who doesn't fit that mold
Is a threat.
is a threat.
Right.
And it's not just immigration.
No.
His policies on health care, environmental regulations, taxes,
Yeah.
they're all tended to benefit, wealthy Americans and corporations.
Right.
While often leaving marginalized communities behind.
Exactly. And I think this is where the conversation about systemic racism becomes really important.
Yeah.
It's not always about these overt, intentional acts of discrimination.
Right.
It's about the way that policies and systems are structured to perpetuate inequality.
Yeah, so even if he wasn't explicitly saying, I'm going to implement racist policies,
Right.
the outcome was often the same.
The outcome was often the same. Exactly.
And that, I think, is what makes this whole discussion so difficult.
It does.
It's trying to separate intent from impact.
Because sometimes, the impact is what matters most.
Yeah.
And when we look at the cumulative effect of his policies on communities of color, it's hard to argue that they weren't harmful.
Okay, so we've talked about his presidency, the attacks on institutions, the divisive policies, the impact on marginalized communities.
Yeah.
I know you're not a fortune teller,
I'm not.
but I have to ask, if he were to return to power in 2024,
Yeah.
what could that mean for America?
Well, it's impossible to predict the future with certainty,
Right.
but we can look at the patterns of his past behavior and extrapolate from there. And what we see is this consistent disregard for democratic norms,
Yeah.
this willingness to exploit racial divisions,
Yeah.
and a real focus on consolidating power rather than serving the common good.
So we're talking about a potential amplification of all the trends we've already discussed.
That's a real possibility.
More attacks on the media, more erosion of trust, more policies that benefit the wealthy
Yeah.
at the expense of the vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest concerns is the normalization of these behaviors.
Yeah.
His first term showed us that there are segments of the population that are willing to accept or even embrace this kind of leadership.
And that's the scariest part.
It is scary.
Yeah. It's not just about him as an individual.
Right.
It's about the larger shift in political culture that he represents.
Yeah, he's tapped into something deep within American society.
Yeah.
This current of resentment and anxiety.
Right.
and this longing for a simpler time.
Yeah.
And whether he wins or loses in 2024, those underlying forces, they're not going away anytime soon.
So we're left with this kind of unsettling question.
Yeah.
Even if he doesn't return to power, has he already done irreparable damage to the fabric of American democracy?
I think that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it's one that historians are going to be debating for years to come.
Oh, for sure.
But one thing is clear. His presidency has left a lasting mark on American politics.
Yeah.
And the consequences of that are going to continue to reverberate.
For generations to come.
Yeah.
It's heavy stuff.
It is.
And I can already feel you, the listener, out there
Right.
processing all of this.
Yeah.
And it's important, I think, to pause here, take a breath, and really consider what we've learned.
What we've talked about.
Because in our final part, we're going to shift gears a little bit.
We are.
From analyzing the past
Yeah.
to looking ahead.
To looking ahead at the future.
At the future.
Yeah.
And we're going to discuss what steps can be taken to protect democratic values.
Right.
To promote a more just and equitable society.
Regardless of what the future holds.
Yeah. Regardless of what happens in 2024 and beyond. All right. So we're back for the final part of our deep dive into, I guess, the political legacy of Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's been a heavy conversation.
It has.
A lot to think about.
We've covered a lot of challenging territory, from that fiery campaign rhetoric to the actual policies implemented during his presidency, and then, just thinking about the potential implications of a second term.
Right, trying to grapple with what all of that means.
Yeah, and I think, I hope that you, the listener out there, have come away feeling informed.
Yeah.
Feeling maybe empowered.
Yeah.
And maybe even a little bit hopeful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we've spent a lot of time kind of dissecting the problems.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to end on a note of solutions.
Totally. Like, what can people actually do?
Right, practically.
Practically to safeguard, our democracy.
Yeah.
To build a more just and equitable future.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that is about reclaiming our information ecosystem.
Okay. Reclaim our information ecosystem.
Because we've talked a lot about, misinformation and the erosion of trust in reliable sources of information.
So how do we combat that?
Well, I think it starts with becoming more discerning consumers of information.
Okay, so not just reading headlines.
Right, not just, scrolling through social media and taking everything at face value.
But really digging deeper.
Yeah, checking sources.
Considering different perspectives.
Exactly. I mean, it's like we all need to become fact checkers in our own lives.
Oh, totally.
Develop a healthy skepticism, learn to identify bias, and don't just accept things at face value.
Yeah, and when you encounter misinformation.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to call it out.
Yeah, politely but firmly.
Politely but firmly, right?
Correct the record, share credible sources.
Yeah.
And just try to help other people navigate this incredibly complex information landscape that we're all living in.
Yeah, be an active participant.
Yeah.
In that fight against misinformation.
Right, exactly. Not just a passive consumer.
And don't underestimate the power of conversation.
Oh, absolutely.
Talk to your friends and family about these issues.
Yeah, even if it's uncomfortable.
Even if it's hard.
Right, because shutting down conversations or retreating into echo chambers.
Yeah.
Where we only hear from people who agree with us.
Right.
That just makes the problem worse.
Yeah, we need to bridge those divides.
I do.
Find that common ground.
Exactly.
Recognize that we're all in this together, even if we don't always see eye to eye. And, this may sound cliche, but democracy thrives on participation.
It does.
So vote,
Every election.
Every election, local, state, national, it all matters.
It all matters.
Contact your elected officials. Make your voice heard on issues that you care about.
Support organizations that are working to protect voting rights.
Yeah,
Your fair elections.
And it's not just about voting either.
Right.
It's about being an active citizen in your community.
Yeah.
Volunteer, attend town hall meetings, get involved in local initiatives.
These small acts of engagement, when they're multiplied across millions of people,
can really create a powerful force for change.
Totally. And don't underestimate the importance of education.
Oh, education is key.
Learn about the history of social movements.
Yeah, study the tactics of successful organizing.
Understand how power structures work.
Because knowledge is power, but only if we use it.
Totally. Only if we put it into action.
And remember, I think this is important. Change doesn't happen overnight.
It doesn't. It's a long game.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
And there are going to be setbacks along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. But don't get discouraged.
Don't give up.
Every act of resistance, every voice that's raised in defense of democracy and justice, it makes a difference.
It does.
And, even when things feel overwhelming, remember that you're not alone.
Yeah.
There are millions of people out there who share your values, who are fighting for that better future.
Yeah. Find those people, connect with them, learn from them.
Yeah, draw strength from that collective energy.
And don't be afraid to celebrate the small victories along the way.
Yes, celebrate those wins.
Because those small wins, they add up.
They do, they really do.
And, it's about finding hope in the midst of all the darkness.
Yeah, and remembering that we do have the power.
We do.
To shape the future that we want to see.
Absolutely, and I think that's the message I really want to leave you with. You have agency, you have a voice, and you have the power to make a difference.
So that's it for our deep dive into this very complex, very challenging topic.
It's been a journey.
It has, but I really hope you've come away feeling informed, empowered, maybe even a little bit hopeful, and, ready to take action.
Because the future isn't predetermined. It's shaped by the choices that we make every day.
So go out there, make your voice heard, stand up for what you believe in, and fight for the world that you want to live in.
Because the power really is in your hands.
So use it wisely.
That's right.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, May.